The church bells rang softly in the distance as gray clouds gathered overhead, perfectly matching the somber mood of the day. Rain threatened, but hadn't yet fallen, just like the tears many were still holding back. Father Michael stood at the entrance of St. Catherine's Church, greeting the mourners as they arrived for Eleanor Jenkins' funeral service. His kind eyes offered silent comfort to each person who passed. Father Michael had been serving this community for over 20 years. At 58, with salt and pepper hair and gentle wrinkles around his eyes from years of both smiling and frowning, he had seen more endings than beginnings lately. This wasn't his first funeral this month, and it wouldn't be his last. Yet, each one still touched him deeply. He never allowed himself to become numb to people's grief. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," he said softly to an elderly woman who patted his hand as she entered. Eleanor was lucky to have such a loyal friend. The woman nodded, dabbing her eyes with an already damp handkerchief before making her way inside. Tulle, small stone church had stood in this town for over a century. Its wooden pews were worn smooth from generations of worship, celebration, and mourning. Today they slowly filled with people dressed in black, neighbors, friends, colleagues, and family of Eleanor Jenkins, who had passed away at 73, after a brief but fierce battle with cancer. Father Michael checked his watch. 10 minutes until the service would begin. He stepped inside, closing the heavy wooden door behind him. The familiar scent of old hymnals, wood polish, and today's fresh lilies filled his nostrils. Eleanor had always loved lilies. Her daughter-in-law, Beth, had made sure there were plenty surrounding the casket. As he made his way toward the altar, Father Michael observed the gathering with practiced eyes. Funerals revealed so much about families, who sat together, who kept their distance, who sobbed openly, and who remained stoically silent. The Jenkins family was no exception. In the front row sat Robert, Eleanor's only son. At 45, he looked older today than Father Michael had ever seen him, his shoulders hunched forward, his gaze fixed on the polished shoes he wore. Beside him, his wife Beth sat ramrod straight, her hand occasionally reaching over to touch her husband's arm in what appeared to be comfort, though something in her expression seemed forced. The church continued to fill, but Father Michael's attention was drawn to the far side of the front row where Martha, Eleanor's younger sister, sat with her husband Tom. There was a space, a deliberate empty seat, between them and where Robert sat. Martha's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes reddened but dry. She hadn't acknowledged Robert once since arriving, though they'd been only feet apart for nearly 20 minutes. Father Michael had known Eleanor for most of his time at St. Catherine's. She had been a regular at Sunday services, had organized countless charity events, and had come to him for guidance during difficult times. She'd confided in him about her disappointments as well as her joys. Her relationship with Robert had been complicated, full of love, but also tension, especially in recent years. She wasn't happy with some of his choices, she had told Father Michael during their last conversation, just 2 weeks before her passing. She hadn't elaborated, and he hadn't pushed. Now, watching Robert avoid Martha's section of the pew, Father Michael wondered what those choices might have been. He walked to the small room behind the altar to don his vestments. The familiar ritual of preparing for service usually centered him, but today he felt uneasy. Something about this funeral felt different. When he emerged, the church had filled completely. Nearly 100 people had come to say goodbye to Eleanor. Some stood at the back, there being no more room in the pews. Father Michael took his position and nodded to the organist, who began playing a gentle hymn that Eleanor had selected herself. The funeral director, Mr. Patterson, a thin man with a permanently solemn expression, opened the church doors one last time. 6 pallbearers entered carrying Eleanor's casket, a simple but elegant wooden box with brass handles. Robert was not among them. Instead, Tom, Martha's husband, led the group, along with Eleanor's nephew David, and 4 men from the community center where Eleanor had volunteered for decades. As the casket was placed at the front of the church, Father Michael noticed Robert's hands tightening into fists on his knees. Beth whispered something to him, and he visibly forced himself to relax them. The organ music faded, and Father Michael stepped to the pulpit to begin the service. He welcomed everyone, his voice calm and steady as it carried through the church. "We are gathered here today to remember and celebrate the life of Eleanor Jenkins," he began, looking out at the sea of faces. A beloved mother, sister, aunt, and friend to so many in our community. As he spoke about Eleanor's life, her dedication to family, her tireless volunteer work, her famous apple pies at the church bake sale, he noticed something odd. Whenever he mentioned Eleanor's generosity, Martha would glance sideways toward Robert, whose jaw tightened each time. Father Michael had prepared notes for his eulogy, but as he spoke, he found himself watching the family dynamics unfold before him. When he mentioned how Eleanor had helped establish the town's food pantry, Martha nodded proudly. When he spoke of Eleanor's devotion to her family, Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Eleanor believed in honesty above all else. "Father," Michael said, recalling their many conversations. "She used to say that truth was the foundation of every meaningful relationship." At this, Martha let out a sound, something between a laugh and a sob, quickly muffled by her handkerchief. Robert's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he turned slightly toward his aunt. Their eyes met for a brief electric moment before both looked away. The tension in that glance was unmistakable. Father Michael had witnessed family disagreements at funerals before. They were unfortunately common, but this felt deeper, more significant. There was something unresolved hanging in the air between Eleanor's son and her sister. Father Michael continued with the service, inviting David, Eleanor's nephew, to read a passage from Eleanor's favorite book. As David spoke, Father Michael noticed Robert checking his phone discreetly, his expression changing from grief to what looked like worry before he quickly pocketed the device again. Beth noticed too, giving her husband a questioning look that he ignored. When it came time for personal reflections, Martha stood to speak. Her voice, though quiet, carried strength as she talked about growing up with Eleanor, about her sister's unfailing moral compass and commitment to what was right. "My sister believed that in the end, we are all accountable for our choices," Martha said, her eyes briefly flicking toward Robert. "She lived by that principle every day of her life." Robert stared straight ahead, his face expressionless, but for the muscle working in his jaw. When Martha finished, there was a moment of silence. Everyone expected Robert to speak next, but he remained seated. Beth gave him a gentle nudge, but he shook his head slightly. Father Michael waited a beat longer before moving forward with the service, covering Robert's silence with a graceful transition to the next hymn. As the congregation sang, Father Michael noticed whispers among some of the attendees, subtle glances toward Robert. It wasn't uncommon for grief to render people speechless, but something about Robert's refusal felt deliberate, almost defiant. The service continued, and as Father Michael prepared for the final blessing, he glanced down at the open casket. Eleanor looked peaceful, dressed in her favorite blue dress, her silver hair neatly arranged, her hands folded over a small prayer book. It was then that Father Michael noticed something unusual peeking out from beneath Eleanor's folded hands, what appeared to be the corner of an envelope. He blinked, wondering if his eyes were playing tricks on him, but no, there was definitely something there that shouldn't be. As he spoke the final blessing, his eyes kept returning to that envelope. Protocol dictated that no unauthorized items be placed in the casket. Mr. Patterson was usually meticulous about such things. The service concluded and the congregation rose for the final viewing. Family members approached first. Martha lingered by the casket, whispering something to Eleanor before stepping away, her eyes briefly meeting Father Michael's with an expression he couldn't quite read. When Robert approached with Beth, his steps were reluctant. He barely looked at his mother before turning away quickly. As people filed past the casket, Father Michael remained nearby, his curiosity about the envelope growing by the minute. What he didn't know then was that this small, seemingly insignificant detail would soon change everything, not just for the Jenkins family, but for him as well. The funeral service had ended, but Father Michael's day was far from over. As the mourners filed out of the church to prepare for the burial, he remained behind, his eyes drawn repeatedly to Eleanor's casket, specifically to that mysterious envelope partially tucked beneath her folded hands. The church was nearly empty, now. Only Mr. Patterson, the funeral director, remained, quietly organizing his materials at the back of the room. Father Michael approached the casket, telling himself he was simply paying his final respects to Eleanor in private. But the truth was, he couldn't stop thinking about that envelope. Standing beside the open casket, he looked down at Eleanor's peaceful face. In death, the lines of worry that had marked her final years had smoothed away. She looked serene, almost younger. "What did you put there, Eleanor?" he whispered, his eyes moving to her hands. Now that he was closer, he could see that it was indeed an envelope. Cream-colored, standard size, with something written on it in elegant handwriting that was unmistakably Eleanor's. From this angle, he could make out only a few words: the truth about Robert. Father Michael's heart skipped a beat. He glanced over his shoulder. Mr. Patterson was still occupied, his back turned. No one else was around. Was this why Martha and Robert had been so tense with each other? Did Martha know about this envelope? Did Robert suspect something? Father Michael had known Eleanor well enough to understand she wasn't the type for dramatic gestures. If she had arranged for this envelope to be placed with her in death, she must have had a serious reason. He remembered a conversation they'd had about 6 months ago. Eleanor had come to the church on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, asking if they could talk. It wasn't a formal confession, just a chat between old friends. She had seemed troubled. "I've been looking through my financial statements," she had told him, her voice low despite there being no one else around. "Some things don't add up, Michael." He had urged her to speak with her financial advisor or perhaps consult a lawyer, but she had shaken her head. "It's not that simple," she'd said. "It involves family." Now, looking at that envelope, Father Michael wondered if this was what she had meant. Had she discovered something about Robert? And why place this information in her casket rather than addressing it while she was alive? "Father?" Mr. Patterson's voice made him start. "We should be closing the casket soon. The cemetery staff is expecting us in 30 minutes. "Yes, of course," Father Michael replied, stepping back from the casket. "I was just saying goodbye." Mr. Patterson nodded respectfully and moved toward the casket. Father Michael's mind raced. If the envelope was sealed now, its contents might never be known. Whatever truth Eleanor wanted revealed would be buried with her. "Mr. Patterson," he said suddenly, "did you notice that envelope?" The funeral director looked confused for a moment, then leaned over to look where Father Michael was pointing. "No, I didn't," he said, frowning. "That's not standard procedure. We check for personal items before the viewing." "Perhaps a family member placed it there during the service," Father Michael suggested. "That would be unusual," Mr. Patterson replied. "But not unheard of. Sometimes family members slip notes or small mementos in at the last moment." He hesitated. "Should we remove it?" Father Michael found himself at a crossroads. Professional protocol said yes. Unauthorized items shouldn't remain. But something deeper, perhaps his intuition as both a priest and a person who had known Eleanor, made him pause. "Who authorized the casket arrangements?" he asked instead. "The son, Robert," Mr. Patterson answered, though the sister, Martha, brought most of the personal items, the prayer book, the rosary, the jewelry. That made sense. Martha had been closer to Eleanor in recent years, and if Martha had brought the items, perhaps she knew about the envelope too. Or maybe she had placed it there herself? "I think," Father Michael said carefully, "we should respect the family's wishes. If they placed it there, they must have had a reason." Mr. Patterson nodded, though he still looked slightly uncomfortable. "As you wish, Father. We'll be ready to transport to the cemetery in 15 minutes. After the funeral director walked away, Father Michael found himself alone with Eleanor once more. The envelope seemed to call to him. What was written inside? Was it something that could hurt Robert? Or perhaps heal whatever rift had existed in this family? His thoughts were interrupted by soft footsteps. Turning, he saw Beth, Robert's wife, walking slowly down the aisle toward him. Her face was drawn, eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Father," she said quietly, "may I have a moment alone with her?" "Of course," he replied, moving to step away. Beth reached out suddenly, her hand catching his sleeve. "Wait," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to ask you something." Father Michael paused, noticing the tension in her expression. "What is it?" Beth glanced toward the church doors as if checking they were truly alone. "During Eleanor's final days," she began, Did she say anything to you? About Robert, I mean?" The question caught him off guard. "Nothing specific," he answered truthfully. "Why do you ask?" Beth's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Things haven't been right for a long time," she said. "Eleanor knew something was wrong, but Robert wouldn't talk to her about it. Not to me either." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "I'm worried, Father. Really worried." "About what?" he asked gently. "About what happens next," she replied cryptically. Eleanor was the only one who knew the whole truth, and now her voice trailed off as she looked at the casket. Father Michael felt a chill run down his spine. There was something here, something serious that connected Eleanor, Robert, and that envelope. "Beth," he said carefully, "do you know about an envelope?" Her reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath, her eyes widening slightly before she composed herself. "What envelope?" she asked, but her voice had changed, become guarded. "There appears to be an envelope with Eleanor," he said, watching her closely. "Under her hands. Did you know about it?" Beth's eyes darted to the casket, then back to Father Michael. "I should go," she said suddenly. "Robert will be wondering where I am." She hurried away before he could say anything else, her hasty retreat only confirming his suspicions. Beth knew something, perhaps not about the envelope specifically, but about whatever truth it contained. Left alone again, Father Michael faced a difficult decision. The burial would take place soon. Once the casket was closed and lowered into the ground, that envelope and whatever revelations it contained would be lost forever, yet it wasn't his place to interfere. If Eleanor had arranged this, she must have had her reasons. Perhaps those reasons included keeping the contents of that envelope private, buried with her. Or perhaps a new thought occurred to him. What if Eleanor had wanted the envelope to be noticed? What if placing it partially visible was deliberate, a final message that someone was meant to intercept? His thoughts were interrupted as people began returning to the church for the procession to the cemetery. Robert entered first, his face a mask of control. Martha followed shortly after, keeping her distance. The tension between them seemed to have grown rather than diminished during the brief break. The pallbearers approached the casket to close it for transport. It was now or never. Father Michael had seconds to decide. He stepped forward. "Just a moment, please," he said to the pallbearers, who respectfully stepped back. Father Michael leaned over Eleanor one last time as if giving a final blessing. In a swift, subtle movement, he slipped the envelope from beneath her hands and into his sleeve. "Goodbye, Eleanor," he whispered, genuinely meaning it as both farewell and apology for his action. "May you rest in peace." As he stepped back and the pallbearers closed the casket, Father Michael felt the weight of the envelope against his wrist. Whatever truth Eleanor had wanted to share from beyond the grave was now in his hands. The procession to the cemetery was a blur. Father Michael performed the burial rites with practiced dignity, all the while acutely aware of the envelope now safely tucked inside his pocket. Throughout the service, he noticed Martha watching Robert with barely concealed animosity. Robert, for his part, seemed eager for the whole thing to be over, checking his watch repeatedly. After the final prayers, as people began to disperse, Father Michael found himself approached by both Martha and Robert, separately, within minutes of each other. "Father," Martha said quietly, "might we speak privately tomorrow? There's something important I need to discuss with you." Before he could answer, she walked away, passing Robert without acknowledgement. Moments later, Robert cornered him by the cemetery gates. "Father Michael," he said, his voice tight with what might have been anxiety. "I was wondering if my mother mentioned anything to you in her final days? Anything about family matters?" "Nothing specific," Father Michael replied, the same answer he'd given Beth. "Why do you ask?" "No reason," Robert said too quickly. "Just wondering what her state of mind was at the end." As Robert walked away to join Beth at their car, Father Michael touched his pocket where the envelope sat hidden. Whatever game was being played here, he now had what seemed to be the key piece. Back at the rectory that evening, Father Michael placed the unopened envelope on his desk and stared at it for a long time. The full text on the front was now visible. "The truth about Robert, to be opened after my death." His hand hovered over it. Should he open it? Or should he call Martha and Robert together first? The weight of responsibility pressed down on him. Whatever was in this envelope could tear a family apart, or perhaps begin to heal wounds that had festered for too long. Father Michael made his decision. He reached for his phone. The evening shadows grew long across Father Michael's small office as he sat at his desk, the envelope resting before him like a ticking bomb. The room was quiet except for the gentle ticking of the old wall clock and the occasional creaking of the rectory's aged wooden floors. He had made his phone call, not to Martha or Robert, but to his old friend Judge Wilson, asking hypothetically what his responsibility would be if he came across evidence of a possible crime. "Depends on the crime, Michael," the judge had said, "and how you came across it. But generally speaking, the law expects citizens to report serious wrongdoing." Father Michael hadn't elaborated further, thanking his friend before hanging up. Now he sat alone with his thoughts in Eleanor's envelope. The rectory cat, an orange tabby named Pete, jumped onto his desk and nudged his hand, seeking attention. Father Michael absently stroked the cat's fur while staring at Eleanor's elegant handwriting. "What would you do, Pete?" he murmured. The cat merely purred in response. After another long moment of contemplation, Father Michael reached for his letter opener, a silver one given to him by his parish when he'd marked 15 years of service. The blade slid easily through the sealed edge of the envelope. He hesitated once more before finally extracting the contents: several folded sheets of paper and what appeared to be photocopies of financial documents. The first page was a handwritten letter in Eleanor's distinctive script. "Dear Father Michael, because I know it will be you who finds this. If you're reading these words, I have passed on, and you've discovered my final message. Forgive me for this unusual method of communication, but I've learned some things that I couldn't address while alive. Partly out of fear, partly out of love for my son despite everything. What you hold in your hands is evidence that Robert has been systematically stealing from me for the past 3 years. Father Michael's hand trembled slightly as he continued reading. Eleanor detailed how she had discovered discrepancies in her accounts, how certain valuable items had gone missing from her home, and how Robert had tricked her into signing documents she didn't understand. The attached financial records showed large transfers from Eleanor's accounts to companies Father Michael had never heard of. According to Eleanor's notes, these were shell companies Robert had created to funnel her money into his own pockets. I've lost nearly 2/3 of my savings, Eleanor's letter continued. Money that was meant to establish a community scholarship, fund upon my death, a project Martha knew about and Robert pretended to support. Father Michael set down the papers, feeling suddenly ill. He remembered Robert's generous donations to the church, his expensive new car last year, the lavish vacation he and Beth had taken to Europe. Had all that been funded with stolen money? Money meant for local students who needed help with college? The letter concluded with a request that stunned Father Michael even further. I don't seek vengeance, Father. I seek restoration. I want the money returned to create the scholarship fund as intended. I'm trusting you to find a way to make this right without destroying what remains of our family. Martha knows some of this, but not all. She suspected, but I never confirmed her fears. While I lived, I ask that you bring them together and find a path to resolution and, God willing, eventual forgiveness. Father Michael leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. This was far beyond the normal family disputes he helped mediate. This was potential criminal fraud. He gathered the papers and locked them in his desk drawer. Sleep would be difficult tonight. He needed time to think, to pray, to decide on the right course of action. The next morning brought a gray drizzle that matched Father Michael's mood. He had slept poorly, his dreams filled with images of Eleanor, her expression sad and disappointed. He'd woken several times, each time reaching for the bedside lamp to reassure himself that the envelope and its contents were real, not just a troubled dream. He was on his second cup of coffee when the rectory doorbell rang. Through the peephole, he saw Martha standing on the porch, her coat collar turned up against the light rain. He opened the door with a sense of inevitability. "Good morning, Father," she said, her voice subdued. "I hope I'm not too early." "Not at all," he replied, stepping back to allow her inside. "I've been up for hours." He led her to his small living room rather than his office, offering her tea, which she accepted gratefully, wrapping her cold hands around the warm mug. "You know why I'm here," she said after a moment. It wasn't a question. Father Michael nodded slowly. "I think I do. It's about Eleanor and Robert." Martha's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. "My sister was too kind for her own good sometimes, too trusting, especially with people she loved." She set down her mug carefully. "Robert took advantage of that." "What makes you say that?" Father Michael asked, not yet ready to reveal what he knew. Martha's expression hardened. "The numbers didn't add up. Eleanor showed me her bank statements about a year ago. She was confused about some withdrawals, large ones." "When?" she asked Robert. He always had explanations that sounded reasonable enough at the time. Business investments he was making for her. Estate planning strategies. She paused, collecting herself. "But I work in banking, Father. I know when something doesn't look right." I tried to convince her to speak with another financial advisor, but she didn't want to believe Robert would. Her voice broke. Father Michael waited patiently as Martha composed herself. "Did she ever confront him directly?" he asked when she seemed ready to continue. 2 months before she died, Martha nodded. "She wouldn't tell me exactly what happened, but she wasn't the same afterward. She changed her will the next week." This was new information. "Changed it how?" "She removed Robert as executor and named me instead," Martha explained. "The lawyer should be contacting me officially this week. That's partly why I'm here. I wanted you to know there might be some ugliness coming when Robert finds out." Michael considered his next words carefully. "Martha, did Eleanor ever mention anything about evidence? Documentation of what she suspected Robert was doing?" Martha's eyes narrowed slightly. She hinted at something, said she'd taken care of it, so the truth would come out when it needed to. Her gaze sharpened. "Why do you ask, Father? Do you know something?" The moment of decision had arrived sooner than he'd expected. Father Michael took a deep breath. "Yesterday, at the funeral," he began slowly, "I noticed something unusual in Eleanor's casket." Martha leaned forward slightly, her breath catching. "An envelope," she whispered. Father Michael nodded, surprised. "You knew about it?" "I suspected," she said. "Eleanor asked me the oddest question 2 weeks before she died. She wanted to know if funeral directors check items placed with the deceased." Martha's eyes widened suddenly. "You have it, don't you? You took the envelope." There was no point denying it. "Yes." "Have you opened it?" "Yes," he admitted again. "Last night." Martha's hands trembled slightly. "And? What did my sister say?" Instead of answering directly, Father Michael stood and walked to his desk in the adjoining room. He returned with the envelope and its contents, placing them on the coffee table, between them. "I think you should see for yourself," he said quietly. Martha read through the documents slowly, methodically, her expression changing from grief to shock to anger. When she finally looked up, her eyes were blazing. "He stole over $400,000 from her," she said, her voice low but intense. "Money meant for local students, for scholarships." "That's what the documents suggest, Father Michael." agreed carefully. Suggest it's all right here. Martha picked up one of the papers. Account numbers, transfer dates, even the shell companies he created. Eleanor did her homework. She set the paper down with a bitter laugh. My sister was always thorough, even when her heart was breaking. What do you want to do with this information? Father Michael asked gently. Martha looked at him with surprise. Do? We go to the police, of course. This is theft, plain and simple. That's one option, Father Michael acknowledged. But Eleanor specifically asked for another approach. He pointed to the final paragraph of her letter. Martha read it again, her brow furrowed. She wanted restoration, not punishment, she murmured, sounding conflicted. That's just like her. She wanted me to bring you and Robert together, Father Michael continued, to find a way forward that honors her wishes without destroying your family. Family? Martha's laugh was hollow. Robert destroyed that the moment he decided to steal from his own mother. Perhaps, Father Michael said softly, but people can change. They can make amends. Martha was silent for a long moment, staring at the documents spread before her. Finally, she looked up, her expression resolute but calmer. What did you have in mind, Father? Before he could answer, the doorbell rang again. Father Michael felt a strange sense of déjà vu as he walked to the door and checked the peephole. Robert stood on the porch looking anxious and slightly disheveled, as if he hadn't slept well either. Father Michael turned back to Martha, who had followed him into the hallway. It seems we won't have to wait to begin this conversation, he said quietly. Martha's face paled, but she nodded firmly. Let him in. As Father Michael reached for the doorknob, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would change these people's lives forever. He said a silent prayer for guidance, then opened the door to face the man whose secrets now lay exposed on his coffee table. Robert, he said evenly, I've been expecting you. Please come in. Your aunt and I were just talking about Eleanor, and about you. Robert's eyes darted past Father Michael to where Martha stood in the hallway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. For a moment he looked like he might turn and run. Instead he stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded final, like the turning of a key in a lock. The moment of truth had arrived. Robert stepped into Father Michael's home, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The narrow hallway suddenly felt too small for the three of them. Rainwater dripped from Robert's coat onto the worn welcome mat. I tried calling you earlier, Robert said to Father Michael, his voice strained. Your phone went straight to voicemail. Father Michael nodded. I turned it off last night. I needed time to think. He gestured toward the living room. Please, join us. Robert followed, his footsteps heavy on the old wooden floor. When he entered the living room and saw the papers spread across the coffee table, he froze. Even from where he stood, the bank statements and account numbers were clearly visible. What is this? He asked, though his ashen face suggested he already knew. Martha, who had returned to her seat, picked up Eleanor's letter. The truth, she said simply. Finally. Robert's eyes darted between the papers, Martha and Father Michael. For a moment, he seemed about to deny everything. His mouth opened, then closed again as he saw the familiar handwriting on the letter Martha held. Where did you get those? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Your mother left them, Father Michael explained, keeping his tone neutral. In her casket. I believe she wanted them to be found. Robert sank into the armchair furthest from Martha, his body suddenly seeming smaller. I can explain, he began, but Martha cut him off with a sharp laugh. Can you explain stealing $400,000 from your dying mother? She asked. Can you explain creating fake companies to hide the money? Please, I'd love to hear that explanation. Father Michael raised his hand slightly. Martha, he said gently, let's try to keep this civil. We're here to find a solution, not to condemn. Condemn? Martha's voice rose. He stole from his own mother. Money that was meant to help students in our community. Robert's face had gone from pale to flushed. "You don't understand," he said, looking at his hands rather than at either of them. "I never meant for it to go this far." "Then help us understand," Father Michael said, taking a seat between them. "What happened, Robert?" For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock and the soft patter of rain against the windows. When Robert finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "It started 3 years ago. My business was failing. I'd taken out loans I couldn't repay. The bank was threatening foreclosure on our house." He ran a hand through his hair, which Father Michael now noticed was graying at the temples. "I was desperate. I asked Mom for a loan, but she said she'd already committed her extra funds to that scholarship idea. So you decided to just take it anyway?" Martha asked incredulously. Robert winced. "I only meant to borrow a small amount, just enough to keep things afloat until business improved. I was going to pay it back." "With interest, I'm sure," Martha said sarcastically. "I set up the first transfer thinking it would be a one-time thing," Robert continued, ignoring her comment. "But then there were more expenses, more problems. It became too easy to go back to that well." Father Michael studied Robert's face. There was shame there, certainly, but also something else. Relief, perhaps. The relief of a secret finally exposed? "Did Eleanor confront you about this?" Father Michael asked. Robert nodded slowly. 2 months ago, she'd been reviewing her accounts and noticed the discrepancies. She asked me directly if I knew anything about it. His voice cracked. "I denied it at first, but she knew. She always could tell when I was lying ever since I was a kid." "What did she say when she realized the truth?" Father Michael pressed. Robert's eyes filled with tears. "She didn't yell. That almost made it worse. She just looked at me with such disappointment. She said, 'I raised you better than this, Robert.' Then she told me she wouldn't go to the police, but that I needed to make it right." "And did you try?" Father Michael asked. Robert shook his head miserably. "I told her I would, but I didn't know how. The money was gone, most of it anyway. Bad investments, the business eventually failed despite everything." He looked up at them. "I've been living a lie for months, pretending everything was fine, but we're nearly bankrupt. Beth doesn't even know how bad things are." "Oh, I think Beth knows more than you think," Martha interjected. "She's been asking questions for weeks. That's why she came to see me last month." This seemed to genuinely surprise Robert. "Beth came to see you? She never told me that." "She was worried," Martha explained, her tone softening slightly. "She said you'd been acting strange, taking phone calls in private, staying up all night. She thought you might be having an affair." Martha gave a humorless laugh. "I almost wish that had been it." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Father Michael used the moment to collect his thoughts. The situation was even more complicated than he'd imagined. Robert had committed a serious crime, yes, but he was also a man drowning in consequences of his own making. "What happens now?" Robert finally asked, looking directly at Father Michael. "Are you going to call the police?" Before Father Michael could answer, Martha spoke up. "That depends on you, Robert." Both men turned to her, surprised by the change in her tone. "Eleanor wanted the money to go to the scholarship fund," she continued. "That was her dream. If we can find a way to make that happen, maybe we can honor her wishes without destroying what's left of this family." "But I told you," Robert said, frustration edging into his voice. "The money's gone, and I'm broke." "Not all of it is gone," Martha countered. "I've been executor of Eleanor's estate for exactly 2 days, and I've already found some interesting things, like a vacation property in the mountains that was transferred to your name last year, and an investment account with nearly $100,000 that somehow doesn't appear in any of Eleanor's records." Robert's face flushed again. "Those were legitimate gifts," he began, but Martha held up her hand. "Save it, Robert. We both know that's not true." She leaned forward, her expression intense but no longer angry. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign those assets back over to the estate. You're going to come clean to Beth about everything. And you're going to work with me and Father Michael to establish the scholarship fund that Mom wanted." "And if I refuse?" Robert asked, though his tone lacked conviction. Martha picked up Eleanor's letter and held it out to him. "Read the last paragraph," she said quietly. "Read what your mother wanted." Robert took the letter with shaking hands. As he read, tears began to spill down his cheeks. "She still wanted to protect me," he whispered, "even after everything I did. She loved you," Father Michael said simply. "Despite it all." Robert wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I don't deserve that, love." "Perhaps not," Father Michael agreed. "But that's the nature of true love. It's not earned. It's given freely even when we don't deserve it." Martha, who had been watching Robert intently, seemed to come to a decision. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain, for a long moment before turning back. "I'm not going to the police," she said finally. "Not if you make this right. Not if you honor Eleanor's wishes." "Why?" Robert asked, looking genuinely confused. "After what I did?" "I'm not doing it for you," Martha interrupted. "I'm doing it for Eleanor, and for Beth, and for any chance we might have of being a family again someday." Her voice softened. "Your mother believed in second chances, Robert. I'm trying to do the same." Father Michael watched something shift in Robert's expression, the first glimmer of hope breaking through the shame and fear that had dominated his features since he'd entered the room. "I don't know where to start," Robert admitted. "You start by telling the truth," Father Michael said. "To Beth, to yourself. No more lies, no more hiding." "And then you work," Martha added. "You work to rebuild what you've broken. Trust, relationships, your mother's dream. It won't be easy," Father Michael warned. "The road to redemption never is, but you won't walk it alone." Robert looked at the letter in his hands once more, then carefully folded it and placed it back on the table. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes." Father Michael felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. This was just the beginning of a difficult journey, but it was a beginning. Eleanor's unorthodox method had worked. The truth was, out and healing, however painful, could now begin. As they sat in Father Michael's small living room, the rain outside began to ease, thin streams of sunlight breaking through the clouds. It wasn't a perfect solution. There would be hard conversations and harder work ahead, but it was what Eleanor had wanted. Restoration rather than destruction. Truth rather than secrets. Father Michael looked at the envelope that had started, it all now empty of its explosive contents. Sometimes the truth was a burden and sometimes it was a gift. Today, somehow, it had been both. "Shall we pray together?" he suggested. To his surprise, both Martha and Robert nodded. As they bowed their heads, Father Michael thought of Eleanor, her wisdom, her forgiveness, her final act of love. She had known that some truths needed to be spoken, even from beyond the grave, and, in that moment, though none of them said it aloud, all three felt her presence in the room, watching over them as they took their first tentative steps toward healing. 3 months had passed since that rainy morning in Father Michael's living room. Summer had arrived in full force, bringing with it warm breezes and the scent of freshly cut grass. The church garden bloomed with colorful flowers, tended by volunteers who came each Saturday morning. Father Michael sat on a bench beneath the old oak tree, watching butterflies dance around the flower beds. This quiet spot had become his favorite place to think, and lately, he'd had much to consider. The envelope that had once held Eleanor's secrets now sat empty in his desk drawer, a reminder of how a small thing could change so many lives. Sometimes he wondered if he had done the right thing by removing it from Eleanor's casket, but on days like today, he felt certain she would have approved. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel path. Looking up, he saw Beth walking toward him, her face no longer drawn with worry as it had been at the funeral. She carried a small wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Good afternoon, Father," she said, smiling as she reached the bench. "I thought you might be out here." "Beth," he greeted her warmly. "What brings you by today?" She set the basket down between them. Fresh blueberry muffins. I was baking for the committee meeting tomorrow and made extra. She pulled back the cloth to reveal a dozen perfectly golden muffins. And I wanted to give you an update. Father? Michael selected a muffin with a nod of thanks. How are things at home? Beth's expression turned thoughtful. Better. Different, but better. She looked out at the garden. It hasn't been easy. When Robert first told me everything, I was so angry I couldn't speak to him for days. That's understandable, Father Michael said gently. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. Yes, she agreed. But we're working on it. Robert's been seeing that counselor you recommended. He says it's helping him understand why he did what he did. The fear, the pride that kept him from asking for help when the business was failing. She picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. He's different now. More honest. Sometimes brutally so. And how are you doing with all of this? Father Michael asked. Beth smiled slightly. I have good days and bad days. Some mornings I wake up, still angry about the lies. Other days I'm just grateful we're finding our way back to each other. She paused. We sold the house last month. This was news to Father Michael. The big one on Maple Street? She nodded. It was too much. The mortgage, the upkeep. We've moved into a small rental near the community college. It's half the size, but honestly, it feels more like home already. Father Michael could see the truth of this in her face. There was a lightness to Beth now that had been missing before. And the scholarship fund? He asked, knowing this had been the most complicated part of the resolution they'd reached that rainy morning. It's happening, Beth said, her smile widening. The first meeting of the Eleanor Jenkins Memorial Scholarship Committee is tomorrow evening. Martha's been amazing, handling all the legal work to establish it properly. And Robert will be there? He will. It was his idea to name Martha as the chairperson. Beth lowered her voice slightly. I don't think they'll ever be close again, not like before. But last week they had coffee together and talked for over an hour. That's progress. Father Michael nodded, remembering how bitter Martha had been at the funeral. Eleanor would be pleased. That's what keeps Robert going, I think, Beth said, wanting to honor his mother's final wishes. The property in the mountains has been sold, and that money, plus what was left in the investment account, gave the fund a good start. She hesitated. Robert's also committed to contributing 20% of his income for the next 10 years. That's substantial, Father Michael noted, impressed despite himself. He says it's not enough, but it's what he can do. Beth brushed crumbs from her skirt. He's found a new job, by the way. Nothing fancy. He's working at the hardware store downtown. The owner knew Eleanor from church and offered Robert a chance when no one else would. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching a hummingbird dart among the flowers. Father Michael thought about how unexpected life could be, how a discovery at a funeral had set in motion events that were still unfolding. Have you heard about the first recipient? Beth asked suddenly. There's already been a selection? Beth nodded enthusiastically. A local girl, she graduates next week. Single mother working 2 jobs while finishing high school. She wants to study nursing. She reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph, handing it to Father Michael. Martha fast-tracked the process so we could announce it at graduation. The photo showed a young woman with determined eyes and a tentative smile, holding a toddler on her hip. Father Michael felt something catch in his throat. This was exactly the kind of student Eleanor had wanted to help. Her name is Grace, Beth continued. Isn't that fitting? The scholarship will cover her tuition and books for 2 years at community college, plus a childcare stipend so she can focus on her studies. Eleanor would be proud, Father Michael said, handing the photo back. I think so too. Beth took a deep breath. I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness lately, Father. About how hard it is and how necessary. It's a process, not a single act, Father Michael replied. For everyone involved. Beth nodded thoughtfully. Robert still struggles with forgiving himself. That might be the hardest part. Often is, Father Michael agreed. We're usually our own harshest judges. "There's something else," Beth said, her voice dropping. "Something I haven't told anyone yet." She twisted her wedding ring nervously. "I'm pregnant. Almost 3 months along." Father Michael's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Beth, that's wonderful news." "It wasn't planned," she admitted. "With everything that's happened, the financial problems, moving to a smaller place." She looked down at her still flat stomach. "But when I told Robert last week, he cried, said maybe this was a new beginning for all of us." "A wise way to look at it," Father Michael said. Beth stood, brushing invisible crumbs from her pants. "I should go. Robert's waiting at home. We're painting the spare room." She paused. "If it's a girl, we're thinking of naming her Eleanor." Father Michael walked her to her car, the basket of muffins now half empty between them. As they said their goodbyes, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Things weren't perfect. They never would be. But healing had begun. Later that afternoon, Father Michael was surprised when Martha visited his office. She looked different than she had 3 months ago, less burdened, though the lines around her eyes still spoke of grief. "I won't stay long," she said, declining his offer of tea. "I just wanted to drop this off." She handed him an elegant cream-colored envelope. Inside was an invitation to the official launch of the Eleanor Jenkins Memorial Scholarship Fund, to be held at the community center next month. "We'd like you to speak," Martha explained. "About Eleanor, about community, about second chances, if you're willing." "I'd be honored," Father Michael said sincerely. Martha nodded, then hesitated. "There's something else you should know." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin folder. "I found this in Eleanor's safety deposit box last week. It was labeled, 'For Martha, after everything is resolved.'" She handed him a single sheet of paper. It was another letter from Eleanor, dated just a week before her death. Father Michael read it quickly, his eyes widening. "She knew," he said, looking up at Martha. "She knew you'd find the envelope in the casket. She knew what you and Robert would do." Martha's smile was sad but genuine. Apparently she had more faith in all of us than we had in ourselves. She took the letter back, folding it carefully. She wrote that she considered telling me about the envelope directly, but decided that I needed to find my own path to forgiveness, and Robert needed to choose redemption freely. "She was a remarkable woman," Father Michael said. "Yes, she was." Martha stood to leave. "Sometimes I still feel angry about what happened. I probably always will to some degree. But I'm trying to honor her wishes, and seeing that young woman, Grace, get the scholarship, it helps." After Martha left, Father Michael walked back to his spot in the garden. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, and the air was filled with the sound of birds. He thought about Eleanor's final message, her careful planning, her deep understanding of her family. The funeral seemed both yesterday and a lifetime ago. The priest who had noticed something unusual and frozen in shock was still the same man, yet somehow changed. He had been part of a family's darkest moment and was now witnessing their slow journey toward light. As he watched the sun begin its descent, Father Michael reflected on how the most profound truths often came in unexpected ways, sometimes through a sermon or prayer, sometimes through a quiet conversation, and sometimes through an envelope hidden in a casket, waiting to be found by someone who would know what to do with its contents. Eleanor had trusted him with her final truth. That trust had led to pain, yes, but also to healing. To a young mother named Grace who would now have a chance at education. To a family finding its way back from the edge of destruction. To the possibility of forgiveness. Father Michael smiled as the first star appeared in the darkening sky. Some might call it coincidence that he had noticed that envelope during the funeral. He preferred to think of it as something else, a small miracle, of timing and attention. A nudge from beyond that had changed everything, and in that thought he found peace.